Most open world games suck, but at the same time, every single new big budget game is open world. So why are open worlds so popular, and why don't they work? First, we need to determine what an open world game is, because the guidelines aren't exactly clear. Wikipedia says that an open world is a virtual world in which the player can approach objectives freely, as opposed to a world with more linear and structured gameplay. This statement is not complicated, but the difficulty comes in deciding which games this applies to. Modern open worlds follow a different pattern than older titles, and definitions vary in strictness. There are also other complications, like how some games have an open world, but they are not exactly open world games. Most of these factors are subjective, and there's a lot to discuss. For some reason, my personal idea of what an open world game is very restrictive. I think I assume open world games follow the modern formula, and thus I don't consider things like Minecraft and Subnautica to be open world, even though they literally are. But what about something like Terraria? Is it not big enough to be considered an open world? I don't think so. Is size the most important factor other than freedom of gameplay? I would say no, because games will only continue to get bigger, increasing the average size of an open world. But then there's even weirder cases, like LEGO games. There's definitely a better example of the same thing, but LEGO games are what I have experience with. Newer LEGO games have an open world, but the actual levels are not in that world, and are also not open world themselves. And the levels are the substance of the game, so those games can't count as open world. As we've mentioned, classification is mostly subjective and doesn't really matter for my point. If you're questioning whether something is an open world game or not, the odds are it is. So why do they suck? Sometimes an open world does improve the game, but not as often as I would like. From a technical standpoint, open worlds are an amazing sign of advancement in the video game medium. But the same level of scale that delivers that amazement also tends to cause a feeling of emptiness and a lack of importance in most of the world. Our technology is just at the point where we can create these massive worlds, but not developed enough to actually fill them with substance. Dunkey has talked about how a smaller world is more interesting because the gameplay is so much more concentrated, resulting in more exciting discoveries. And that's definitely true, at least for now. If developers take material and experiment in a smaller environment, the results are simpler and better, and most importantly, more fun. An open world encourages spreading out ideas, creating blank space in between. This can make the player feel like the open world isn't related at all to what they're doing, or the identity of the game. An open world is meant to be the most immersive experience possible, but developers often focus on the wrong parts of this. For example, in Bethesda's RPGs, every single object in the world is interactable, but almost none of it is useful at all. It's detail that is completely unnecessary and ends up ignored. Another common critique is a lack of narrative focus or strength. Personally, I don't think storytelling is consistent enough in video games for it to be a priority, especially in a game like this. In a world where the player can go anywhere, the story is restricted to being very simple and sometimes non-essential. Some games, the story is just the backdrop, so it doesn't matter what kind of game it is. Other games choose to have some kind of final objective, but allow the player to fill in everything in between. And some games try to create fleshed out stories in open worlds anyway. Like I mentioned before, technology is a huge limit here. A gigantic world might contain hundreds of NPCs, and trying to voice act each of these characters is a mistake. And everyone knows video game voice acting sucks. For example, in Fallout and the Elder Scrolls, nobody cares about the story, and they just do whatever they want, like you're supposed to in an open world. In Breath of the Wild, the story is so minimal that you can't be truly invested in it, freeing up gameplay. That's an example where the story is really just the setting. The strongest narratives in open worlds are clearly Elden Ring and Red Dead Redemption 2, for very different reasons. Souls games have always had very complex characters and stories, not that I've played many of them, and Red Dead has that very unique group dynamic with more personality and detail than any other game. It is extremely difficult to pull off a quality story in a video game, let alone an open world game. Those are definitely the two largest complaints with the genre, specifically that first one about emptiness, which plagues 90% of open world games. So how can they be improved? As it stands now, it is nearly impossible to create a modern scale open world and completely fill it with value. Even operating on this scale tends to litter these games with bugs and glitches, because with that much content you can't polish every little thing. So from the technology side, we might just have to wait. Options will continue to grow exponentially, but that emptiness is almost unavoidable. Almost. Every piece of the game must be carefully crafted to make sense in an open world. The feeling of seeing something interesting and deciding to go there is wonderful. It is done best in Breath of the Wild and Elden Ring in my experience. There are no limitations, you just go, go, go. That's the essence of what an open world game should be. Like every other component, the story must also perfectly rely on the open world, and there are a variety of ways to do that. But again, for me, the story should almost never be prioritized over the game and the experience. These are exciting times for video games, but extra care has to be taken to deliver the endless possibilities of an open world. Here's a list of most of the open world games that I've played, not completed, aka my resume for making this video. Missing a lot of classics, I'm sure, but maybe it's because they're all bad. Thanks for watching. See ya.